When Family Guy hit television screens more than 2 decades ago, it carved out its identity in the crowded world of animated sitcoms by doing something bold, giving the family dog Brian Griffin a voice. Not just literally, but thematically.
Chris, Bonnie's gone to bed. She's not going to open her curtains again.
While shows like The Simpsons had pets that were largely silent background characters, Family Guy elevated its canine to the role of philosopher, confidant, and occasional scolder of human stupidity. Brian wasn't just another Griffin. He was the conscience of the show, a voice of reason who often pointed out the ridiculousness of the world around him. He was cultured, intellectual, and witty, with just enough cynicism to keep him interesting. But somewhere along the line, something shifted. The Brian that once anchored Family Guy with a strange sense of humanity began to deteriorate into a caricature of his worst traits. His intellect turned into pretentiousness, his moral compass warped into hypocrisy, and his vulnerabilities became overblown flaws played for cheap laughs. This slow decline didn't just alter one character, it mirrored the unraveling of Family Guy itself. So what exactly happened? How did Brian evolve from one of the show's most compelling, emotionally rich characters to one of its most polarizing? And in doing so, did he break not just his own legacy, but Family Guy as a whole? Brian wasn't always the flawed, overexposed character fans love to criticize today. In the earliest episodes of Family Guy, his role was surprisingly minimal. In the pilot, Death Has a Shadow, Brian simply warns Peter against committing welfare fraud, a small moment that barely hinted at the layers the character would later display. At this stage, Brian was more of a background observer, occasionally chiming in with quips or logic when Peter spiraled out of control. This simplicity traces back to Seth MacFarlane's earlier cartoon Larry and Steve, where a smart dog had to babysit his bumbling owner. The DNA of Brian Griffin is obvious, the intelligent animal constantly cleaning up after human stupidity. Yet in these early Family Guy days, Brian lacked the personality traits fans now associate with him. He wasn't particularly snarky, he wasn't politically outspoken, and he wasn't emotionally complex. He was simply the sensible one. That began to change in the Season 1 finale, Brian, Portrait of a Dog. In this episode, Brian is humiliated during a dog show and begins to grapple with his place in a society that treats him as less than human. The story tackles themes of inequality and belonging, even paralleling civil rights issues when Brian is nearly arrested for drinking from a public fountain. For the first time, the audience saw Brian as more than a pet or side character. He was a figure wrestling with identity, loneliness, and the tension of being both human-like and treated as a second-class citizen. This episode signaled Brian's true potential, and the writers seized on it to make him one of the show's emotional cores. With Season 2 and beyond, Brian blossomed into one of Family Guy's most fully realized characters. Episodes like Brian in Love showcased his vulnerabilities, particularly when he develops unrequited feelings for Lois. Instead of treating this as a throwaway gag, the show leaned into the emotional depth, giving Brian moments of painful self-reflection. Viewers began to see him not just as Peter's straight man, but as a flawed and complex individual whose struggles mirrored real human insecurities. Brian also became the vehicle for Seth MacFarlane's worldview. MacFarlane himself has admitted that Brian is essentially his self-insert, politically liberal, atheist, jazz-obsessed, and voiced in his natural speaking tone. This gave Brian a unique place in Family Guy. He wasn't just a character, but a mouthpiece for serious issues like marriage equality or social justice. In a series filled with absurd gags and cutaways, Brian grounded the show by introducing a moral counterbalance. Then came the Brian-Stewie partnership, a pairing that catapulted both characters into fan-favorite status. Beginning with Road to Rhode Island, their adventures combined sharp comedy with surprising tenderness. Episodes like Road to the Multiverse became iconic, blending surreal creativity with real character growth. For a time, Brian and Stewie were the heart of Family Guy, providing not only laughs, but genuine storytelling. At this point, Brian was arguably at his peak. He had evolved from sidekick to central figure, embodying wit, moral weight, and emotional vulnerability. He wasn't perfect, but that was the point. He was relatable. For fans, Brian Griffin represented the promise that Family Guy could be more than just crude jokes. It could be smart, layered, and even heartfelt. As Family Guy moved deeper into the 2000s, Brian's role began to shift in ways that eroded the very traits that once made him compelling. The first signs of decline came when his dynamic with Stewie started overshadowing his original identity. What began as clever pairings in the Road to episodes, Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, and Road to the Multiverse, eventually redefined Brian entirely. Instead of being Peter's moral compass, Brian was reduced to Stewie's partner in crime. His intellect, once a grounding force, was increasingly played off as self-righteousness or hypocrisy, especially when contrasted with Stewie's over-the-top antics. This change was amplified behind the scenes. Seth MacFarlane, who had always infused Brian with his own beliefs and personality, began to step back from Family Guy to focus on other projects like Ted and The Orville. Without his guiding hand, Brian's character slowly warped into an exaggerated version of himself. His political debates became preachy. His ambitions as a writer turned into running jokes about constant failure, and his romantic pursuits felt shallow and unconvincing. Fans began to notice the cracks. What used to be a character with depth and relatability had become inconsistent, at times smug and unlikable. Instead of standing out as a moral center, Brian now blended into the chaos of Quahog, but not in a good way. The carefully balanced flaws that once humanized him were replaced with traits that made him insufferable. This decline wasn't immediate, but it was steady, and by the early 2000s, Brian was a shadow of the character of audiences had originally fallen in love with. The true breaking point came in the infamous season 12-episode Life of Brian. In a shocking twist, Brian is killed off after being struck by a car, only to be replaced by a new dog, Vinny. On paper, this could have been a bold, creative move, an opportunity to explore grief, change, and the importance of Brian's role in the Griffin family. But instead, the storyline felt hollow, like a calculated stunt to shock viewers and boost ratings. Audiences were furious. Brian, despite his flaws, was still one of the show's most beloved characters, and his abrupt death felt like an insult. Worse, Vinny's introduction seemed like a forced attempt to manufacture controversy, rather than tell a meaningful story. Social media erupted with backlash, and petitions demanding Brian's return spread like wildfire. The real problem wasn't just that Brian died, it was that he returned only 2 episodes later. Instead of treating his death as a serious turning point, the writers hit a giant reset button. Fans weren't relieved so much as disillusioned. The message was clear. Nothing on Family Guy really mattered anymore. Character arcs, emotional stakes, even death itself could be undone with little thought. For many viewers, this was the moment the show broke Brian's death, and resurrection didn't just damage his credibility as a character. It underlined how far the series had drifted from the thoughtful, occasionally heartfelt storytelling that defined its early years. It was a gimmick, not growth, and it left scars on the show's legacy. Brian's decline can't be viewed in isolation. His downfall was part of a broader transformation in Family Guy itself. In the earliest seasons, episodes like Portrait of a Dog balanced absurd humor with serious themes like identity, inequality, and belonging. Even when Peter did something ridiculous or Stewie plotted world domination, Brian's presence helped ground the series with emotional weight. But as the seasons piled on, the show's priorities shifted. Instead of character-driven storytelling, Family Guy leaned harder into shock humor, randomness, and cutaway gags. The Griffin family dynamic, once central to the show, was sidelined in favor of increasingly absurd, joke-first writing. In this new landscape, Brian's role as moral compass became irrelevant. Worse, his flaws were amplified to fit the louder, harsher tone of the show. His pretentiousness, arrogance, and failures stopped being humanizing quirks and became defining traits. This mirrored the broader fan divide. Longtime viewers who cherished the golden era of seasons 1 to 3 lamented the loss of heart, while others embraced the mid-2000s chaos of seasons 4 to 9 as peak Family Guy. Still others argue the newer episodes, despite their inconsistency, are sharper than the dark stretch between seasons 12 to 17. Wherever you fall, it's undeniable that Brian's transformation embodies the show's identity crisis. Once the heart of Family Guy, Brian became a reflection of its decline. He stopped being the character you rooted for and became the embodiment of everything fans criticized. In that sense, Brian didn't just break himself, he broke Family Guy. So did Brian Griffin ruin Family Guy, or did Family Guy ruin Brian Griffin? That's the question fans still debate to this day. The truth is, the answer depends entirely on when you first fell in love with the show. If you grew up with the early seasons, when Brian was the intellectual voice of reason wrestling with existential questions, the decline is impossible to ignore. His arc from thoughtful, layered character to self-absorbed hypocrite mirrors the show's descent from clever satire into chaotic parody. For these fans, Brian's transformation is nothing short of tragic. On the other hand, some viewers who discovered Family Guy later have a different perspective. They remember the road to adventures with Stewie, the outrageous plots, and even the controversial stunts like Brian's death as highlights of the show's unpredictability. For them, the flaws are part of the fun. And then there's a third group, fans who argue the series has always been inconsistent, oscillating between brilliance and absurdity. And Brian's decline is just one example of that ongoing chaos. But one thing is undeniable. Brian Griffin represents more than just himself. His rise, fall, and reinvention capture the creative journey of Family Guy as a whole. At its best, the series was bold, funny, and surprisingly heartfelt. At its worst, it was gimmicky, self-indulgent, and hollow. Brian's evolution embodies both extremes. So is Brian Griffin the character who broke Family Guy? Or was he simply the most visible casualty of a show that had already lost its way? Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that Brian's story, from conscience to caricature, remains one of the clearest windows into what made Family Guy both beloved and frustrating. And speaking of frustrating but unforgettable, stick around, because the biggest deaths, fake-outs, and shock twists in Family Guy history deserve a breakdown of their own. Brian broke Family Guy bit by bit. South Park? They just dropped nukes on nations. Up next, 14 minutes of South Park mocking India?